So the Audi A6 is a phenomenal car. It's a mid-sized luxury saloon or sedan car, and it competes directly with the Volkswagen Passat. So in this video, we're just going to take a look at the Audi A6 and look at the best mods and upgrades for this great car. Now, I have to assume that most people buying this car are not buying it because they wanted a hot hatch for blatting round the country roads. They needed something larger for more practical reasons. So the mods that I'm going to be recommending will obviously bear this in mind. We're not going to be looking to take the A6 to the extreme, although that is still an option. There are plenty of upgrade paths that you can take. I've done detailed guides to each of the engines fitted to the Audi A6, and please dive into those if you just want a little bit more detail on how to achieve those higher power figures. But for now, we're just going to look at the A6 as a whole and just look at the best mods and upgrades that will enhance your driver appreciation of this fantastic car. So the A6 was originally released way back in 1994. It was essentially an Audi 100 back then, and it had quite a big range of engines. Now, for me, things started to get interesting on the A6 when the second generation was released in 1997, which ran to 2004. And this generation had that legendary 1.8T 20-valve engine that so many people have just fallen in love with over the years, and it offers so much scope for tuning and performance upgrades. But there was also some very impressive V6 engines. There was even a turbocharged V6 engine in that year range of the Audi A6. So it really was aimed at a wide spectrum of drivers that wanted economy, a workhorse for towing something, a flashy executive car for just zipping around and impressing their mates with oodles of performance on tap, something for the mid-range, for the family man who wants something in between economical and fun to drive, but doesn't want the high running costs associated with those super high performance versions of these engines. From 2004 to 2011, we have the C6 generation of the A6. And again, the engines had all been evolved and they'd gone on to future generations. Direct injection technology was coming in. The diesel engines were starting to switch from the old pumper-ducer engines to the more advanced common rail diesel engines. And the emissions standards were getting much, much stricter. So manufacturers were chasing these emission standards and were introducing things like a cheat device for the Volkswagen groups. They were fitting things like DPF filters and catalysts and just ramping those up. But a lot of manufacturers were essentially cooking the books to meet those really tight emission standards back then. From 2011, we had the C7 generation of the A6 coming out. And again, this had some lovely versions of the engines. And by this point, most of those early problems you had with those older engines had been ironed out. So the engines were approaching their third gen, the Evo versions. The emission standards are even stricter now. So much more of the car's design was modular, which made manufacturing cheaper and more efficient, and somewhat hampered our attempts to upgrade the power. Things like camshaft swaps that we used to do on the older engines are not always a viable option on the new engines because they're all pressed into the head at the factory. So you've essentially got to pick the base power that you really want and then just look to enhance that a little bit further. So we're going to look at mods for the A6 and just go into the details on the engine. The C7 engine sizes range from about 1.8 on the TFSI, which was only available in certain countries. I know it was available in China. Then you had the popular 2-litre TDIs, the 2-litre and the 2.5 TFSIs, which are real powerhouses and still offer phenomenal opportunities to the tuner. Then you had a supercharged V6 and a V6 turbo diesel engine as well. So before we start, please let me know what model of A6 you've got so I can tailor future videos and future articles on the website to that specific model. I always love to know as well what mods you've done to your car, so please pass on your tips. I often recommend parts just based on what people have told me, but I really do love reading your feedback and how you've got on with each of these mods and what you specifically recommend. And don't forget to let me know the year that you've got, because things changed a lot through the different generations and model years on the Audi A6. If you could just boot that like button, that really does help us to get out there. So thanks for that. So let's start out by looking at improving the handling of your Audi A6. So people tend to think about suspension mods and brake mods. So let's just break these down into more detail. So the general idea of your suspension is to just improve the cornering, improve your cornering grip, improve the handling, and your driver experience will dramatically improve. So we're talking about a wide range of years on the Audi A6, and there's certainly a wide range of aftermarket suspension kits. So some of the brands that crop up frequently in our forums and when researching parts and upgrades and talking to enthusiasts at the various shows that I managed to get to, there's some names that just keep cropping up. So let's just rattle off some of these names of suspension kits that you should be looking at for your A6. So we've got IBAC, the D2P, H&R Cup, the AP coilovers, the Connie Sport, the Bilstein springs, the H&R springs and dampers. Now, interestingly, the suspension setup does vary on the A6 depending on the engine and the transmission. So very much the weight of the front end will affect the geometry of the suspension. So it's not just a case of buying an A6 suspension. You need to buy an A6 suspension kit that's been specifically designed for your model of A6. So how far should you drop the suspension on your Audi A6? Well, it depends very much on the engine you've got and the model year and the model generation. So some of the more sporty models are already looking at having a drop of about 40 millimeters or 4 centimeters. So if you've got the sporty suspension setup, it's already been dropped. So generally speaking, from feedback I've had and something that sort of translates across all the model years, is that a drop of about 35 to 30 centimeters seems to work about right. In a lot of cases, you're dropping the front a little more than the rear. So that's one of the unusual things about the Audi A6. It just seems to improve the handling, having the front drop slightly more than the rear. But you'll notice as the suspension ages, the front does tend to sag more anyway. So often people fit these lowering kits and they've not actually gained much lower than their stock system because the stock factory setup has already started to sag. There are kits out there that offer bigger drops of say 40 to 75 millimeters. And these, in my opinion, are a little too extreme. They are not adding much more to the handling characteristics of the car. And in a lot of cases, they can just make the car much more uncomfortable to drive. You get a lot more noise, vibration, harshness from the road when you're enjoying a little bit of spirited driving. But again, there's so many different engines in the Audi A6, so many different models. You've got the Estate or the liftback versions or the Avant versions. You've also got the saloon versions as well. So there's a lot of differences in the weights of these and the way they handle. So your best bet is to get those adjustable kits and set the suspension up to suit your personal driving style. So some of the models actually come with factory suspension. So generally they're about 40 mil lower, not a lot, slightly firmer springs. Everything's just been tuned to give better cornering ability to reduce the body roll. So if you've got one of the less sporty suspension setups, the easy upgrade is just to go to your local breakers yard and get a set from this sporty variant and swap those in. They generally bolt straight on. There's very little extra adjustment actually needed. The 40 millimeter drop is not significant in most cases, so you won't run into problems with arches rubbing and that sort of thing. A lot of the factory sport suspension setups are quite hard. I've had them on cars and it's made the car quite crashy. It's tended to bounce over potholes. It's affected the ride height. So when it comes to the aftermarket options, there's a whole raft of different things to choose from out there. But most people go for coilovers that are adjustable. So you can adjust the ride height at the very least and just set up the ride height to suit your driving style. So if you've got a lot of potholes in your area, a lot of bad roads, you might want a slightly higher ride height. But also you can, on some of these, adjust the spring rate, the firmness of the suspension itself. So you may prefer a slightly softer suspension. I note that a lot of manufacturers in their sporty variants, they've not gone for very hard, very low suspension. They've often lowered it slightly, but they've softened up the suspension just to improve the road handling. So there's a lot of things to consider when it comes to setting up the suspension. You want the wheels to be in contact with the road surface. The suspension itself is designed as the car corners and rolls to adjust the geometry, the angle that the tyres are at, to maximise the amount of cornering grip you have. So even if you don't change the suspension, making sure that the angles on the suspension are set up correctly can make massive differences to the way that the car corners. So the camber angle of the actual wheels, the toe angle, whether they point in or they point out, can have a bearing on its ability to corner, but often improving the cornering affects the straight line stability. So there's often compromises. Some models, it's much more of a challenge to make those adjustments. You might need to get an aftermarket kit to adjust the camber, for example, or to go significantly beyond what the manufacturer has set. But getting your suspension set up by a specialist that knows what they're doing can make a big difference to the way that the car handles. Think also about the suspension mounting points, the bushings. They're generally rubber from the factory. As they get older, they do degrade. So just replacing the old worn bushings with modern bushings can make a big difference. So you can tell if your suspension bushings are worn, generally by the noises you're getting from the suspension. If you're getting a lot of clunks, a lot of vibrations, or maybe even a few creaks, that can be an indicator that those suspension bushings have become worn. There are higher performance alternatives to those factory rubber suspension bushings. They're made from polyurethane. A lot of people go out and buy poly bushes. They're actually available in different hardnesses now. So you might think just going with the hardest one you can is advantageous and will give performance benefits. Well, it will certainly tighten up the suspension, but you will feel every shock and jolt and bump. You'll get a lot more vibration from the road surface. So going for slightly softer suspension bushings can really pay dividends in terms of comfort. And I know that you're not doing your car mods for comfort, but having the car run smoothly over the surface of the road when the road is bumpy can actually improve the cornering and the traction. Whereas if it's skipping about, that can dramatically alter the car's ability to corner and stick to the road surface. So with the A6, once you've handled the suspension upgrades, it's time to think about improving the stopping power. Now, we'll just talk briefly about brakes, but before we go into the details of what you should expect from a brake upgrade, it's worth noting that most of the Audi, Volkswagen Group cars have interchangeable parts. They've used the same platform, so it's generally specific to the year range that your model is in. So they've changed various platform designs. In the main, you can swap brakes from, say, the RS6 to an A6. There's other changes you can make from some of the RS models from the other models in the Audi range. And it's just worth checking the PCD, the offset, the hub sizes. And if they match, then it's a good chance that the brake upgrades will match and you can get much larger brake discs just going to the standard OEM factory lineup. The other thing to make sure is you've got enough space in your alloy rim to accommodate these. So the alloy rim sizes have certainly changed on the A6 over the years. The older models tended to have much smaller rim sizes. We commonly saw the 17s and the 18s on those early ones. Then they sort of transitioned from 18s to 19s, and some of the newer models have even got 20s fitted to them. Now, when it comes to alloy wheel sizes, it will have a detrimental effect on your performance. So most people expect the handling to improve when they fit bigger, wider alloy wheels. But in the wet and on rough road surfaces, that's often not the case. A lot of people are disappointed when they've gone for the largest rims. They look fantastic under the A6 arches, but you do have to be very careful when it comes to selecting them. And you really need to bear in mind the weight of the wheel itself and just make sure you're not adding unnecessary sprung weight to your A6. So with the A6, one of the best things that you should do that's often overlooked is just getting a decent set of tyres for it. The tyres are your main contact patch with the road. So what are some of the things that we should be thinking about when it comes to tyre upgrades on the Audi A6? So don't forget that tyres are probably one of the most significant things you can do to improve the performance of your car. Those 4 points of contact with the road surface are the only way you're going to transmit the power to the road surface. The cornering grip is going to be provided to you as you steer the car. And also the braking power is going to work and you're going to be able to stop the car. So if your tyres are ineffective or just not able to provide enough grip, you are going to suffer on performance. I recently swapped the tyres on my car and it made a night and day difference in terms of getting the traction down. Even in the dry conditions, when the old tyres were reasonably okay, I was getting traction issues when I put my foot down and I explored the upper part of the RPM range. So now with these new tyres, I'm not experiencing that at all. Never underestimate the importance of getting a good set of tyres for your car. The tyres that I fitted to my car were the Uniroyal Rain Sports, and there's a review going up very, very shortly on that. So if it's not up already, be sure to check that video out. But I found those fantastic. They didn't just improve the wet weather grip, they improved the cornering. The car felt differently. It felt like I'd renewed the brakes and the suspension and all the other components, and I didn't have any traction issues whatsoever. ever. So be sure to check out the comments. If you've got a recommendation to make about tyres for this great car, drop it in the comments section so we can share our expertise. You may well have found something that I've not. I don't have the resources to test every tyre out there, so I really do appreciate this feedback. So let us know how you get on with tyre selections and what wheels and tyres you've got on your car. When you start talking about Audi A6 engine mods, most people think straight away of an induction kit and a sports exhaust. So let's just break down induction kits. What can you expect from an induction kit? It will vary depending on the engine you've got. The turbo engines tend to respond a little bit better than the naturally aspirated engines. Now, it doesn't make a substantial amount of power. If you've done nothing else to your engine, you're wasting your money fitting an induction kit to these. The stock factory fuel filter and intake setup flows more than adequately for the stock engine. When you start to ramp the power up significantly, you will start to hit a restriction, and that's the point you need to think about the intake. So I would still recommend going with a performance panel filter. So this replaces the factory paper filter with a higher flowing one. They're typically made of some sort of cotton gauze material. If you've got experience with the full induction kits on these, please let me know. Let me know the models that you fitted or the makes of the induction kit that you fitted. Now let's look at sports exhaust or performance exhaust on the Audi A6. There's a few areas that are typical restrictions in most of the models, particularly the more recent ones with those pollution controls. So let's just break down the exhaust systems and your options when it comes to upgrading them. So why are exhausts good upgrades and good mods? Well, again, it depends on the engine that you've got. The general idea is to remove restrictions in the exhaust. You want those exhaust gases to exit the engine at the fastest velocity possible. Now, the engine is pushing out these exhaust pulses. Don't think of it as a constant stream. I know when you look at the exhaust pipe itself, it seems to have a constant stream, but there's actually pulses coming out of the engine, and that's a good thing. We get a scavenging effect from this. So as each exhaust pulse pushes down the exhaust tube, there is a vacuum that forms just behind that, and that vacuum is actually beneficial to emptying the exhaust from the cylinder and just allows you to get a little bit more fresh air in. If that scavenging effect is lost, i.e. you've got an exhaust size that's too big, you're losing the velocity of the air due to the large bore size. That can have a detrimental effect on the scavenging. So effectively, you'll still have some exhaust gases in the engine on the compression stroke. So that can also lead to other problems. So there's very much a lot of consideration that goes into the design system of an exhaust. And generally, manufacturers have done a reasonable job when it comes to determining the flow rates of exhaust. But bear in mind, they've optimized it for everyday driving, usually for economy purposes. If you're a performance driver and you spend most of your time in the upper end of the RPM range, there's certainly going to be an advantage there to having a larger bore size. So ideally, for high RPMs, you want a large bore size to just maximize the flow, and at low RPM figures you need a narrower bore size just to maintain the velocity. So as the bore size increases, the velocity generally decreases, and it really is velocity that counts. The area that most people should focus on, if it's legal to do so in your area, is the catalysts and the DPFs, the diesel particulate filters. These tend to be the biggest drag, the biggest pain in the exhaust system. There are often sports alternatives that can be fitted legally in a lot of areas, and if that's the case, that certainly is your option to freeing up that lost power due to these devices. So one of the biggest changes that you can make to the engine is within the computer. That's handling the turbo, the fueling, the timing as well. Obviously, these things depend very much on the engine you've got fitted. So let's just talk about ECU tuning or ECU mapping or remapping. So interestingly, depending on where you live, this term has got different labels that are applied to it. So I've done quite a few videos on remapping or tuning the ECU. The ECU is the computer inside the engine. It's controlling everything to do with the way the engine burns the fuel. So diesel engines and gasoline engines have very, very different setups. They work completely differently. Check out the video on the differences between the two if you're not sure. But the ECU itself is controlling generally the fuel delivery, the timing of the air. If it's got a turbocharger, it may well be controlling the boost on the turbo. And the ECU is just monitoring everything going on inside the engine. And generally, if it notices something awry, too much air, too little fuel, it will make an adjustment and just make sure that things are running smoothly. So inside the ECU, you've effectively got a little map that tells the engine what it should be doing at any specific RPM. It tells you what the air to fuel mixture needs to be, where the spark needs to be if your engine has a spark ignition system. There's so many complexities that go on inside the ECU. But with a turbocharged engine, the scope is phenomenal for just increasing the power by changing the tune inside the computer. So for most turbocharged petrol, gasoline or diesel powered cars, you're looking at about 30% more power. Now that's effectively a free mod, a free upgrade. Manufacturers have dialed back the power to meet emissions regulations, conform to the local requirements of the maybe poor quality fuels. The owners are not going to maintain their cars that well, so they have to build in a big safety margin to cope with bad maintenance, dirty plugs, a clogged air filter, that sort of thing. So there's a lot of scope there for just improving what the manufacturer has done. So will that necessarily increase the emissions? Well, it doesn't always. You can make the engine more efficient. You can work to tighter sets of parameters, reducing the fuel consumption and also getting more power from the fuel that you're using. So the theory is that you use less RPMs to get a higher power figure. So if you drive accordingly, on a lot of situations, particularly on diesel engines, you will see better fuel economy after the engine has been tuned or mapped. Gasoline engines are slightly different. You don't always see better fuel economy on those, and most people will tune an engine to get the maximum performance. But check out the other videos I've done on ECU tuning, the pros and cons, the things to look out for, and the sort of things you should take into account when you start looking at this mod. Now, that mod itself helps all the other mods that you've done to work more effectively. So you can just tune the ECU on its own, changing the map, and you will see significantly more power. But if you've changed the air intake, the exhaust, altered the turbo, made other adjustments to maybe the fuel delivery in the engine, you need that ECU to be reprogrammed to take all of that into account. So on the A6, those ECU tunes are generally the last mod you should do because it ties all the other mods in, but it's certainly one of the biggest single power upgrades that you can get. So taking it further, we should start talking about A6 turbo upgrades. So there's quite a few different turbos that have been fitted to the engines over the years. There's generally a lower powered variant, like for some of the generations, there was a 140 horsepower and a 170 horsepower. We've got 150s and 190s now. So generally speaking, swapping the turbo from the higher powered variant to the smaller powered variants is a good, cheap, cost-effective upgrade. So what do we need to know about turbo upgrades on the A6? Well, let's just chat about the options on turbo upgrades and the wide selection of choices and options that you have. So turbocharger upgrades are obviously going to add a lot of power. The turbo is that thing that is compressing the air, allowing more oxygen-laden air to get into the engine. So if you don't have a turbo on the car to start with, it is possible to add an aftermarket turbo, but it is a lot of work. It's normally too expensive for most everyday drivers to consider. Although some models will have kits available where you can upgrade the turbos. So a lot of people will look at the manufacturer's lineup of engines, and if they did say a 1.8 naturally aspirated and a 1.8 litre turbo edition, it's usually cheaper and easier to just swap the engine. Now, because it's the same manufacturer, it's the same engine bay, all of the mounts are generally the same. So it's a much easier task to just swap in the higher powered engine. You've obviously got to think about the computer that controls it and the other ancillary components that are needed to support the larger engine, the higher power engine like the transmission. But you can make really good power gains by adding a turbocharger or even a supercharger to the engine. So I've done other videos discussing the differences between superchargers and turbos. But if your engine is already turbocharged, adding a different turbo can dramatically alter the profile of the power that is produced from the engine. So generally speaking, larger turbos provide much more power at the top end, but they take a while to get going. The turbines in them are somewhat larger. They need a greater velocity of air to get going, so you experience more lag low down. Now, manufacturers have done clever things with twin scroll turbo designs where the exhaust channels are separated, and that maximizes the velocity, and a lot of these turbos will spool up just as quickly as the smaller factory counterparts. Also, we've got variable vane technology into turbos that alter the angle of the air as it goes into the turbo, which again can aid the velocity and help the turbo to spool up more quickly. So there's also some other considerations. if your car engine has variable valve timing on the exhaust and the intake, you generally see better gains than if it's only got variable valve timing on the intake side, because that affects the velocity going into the turbo. So I've heard from people with some engines that have swapped the turbo to a larger one, they haven't got the variable valve technology on the exhaust side, and it's made the turbo very, very sluggish. It spools up very, very slowly, although they are benefiting from higher power figures at the top end of the RPM range. So going outside of the manufacturer's lineup, you can go for a hybrid turbo, which essentially takes the case of a factory turbo. So it's a swap-in replacement, and they've completely changed the internals. They may even have machined out the inside of the turbo to allow the larger compressor wheels to go in, but there's a lot of potential power on offer for turbo upgrades. It is a bit of a minefield. There's so much to choose from. Generally speaking, I'd recommend that you get a kit, get something that bolts straight onto your engine. You don't want to be doing extensive plumbing and extensive rework, but whenever you change a turbo, whichever of these options you go for, you should get an adjustment inside the computer. It's now having a big change in the availability of air at different points in the RPM range. So speak to your tuner, tell him which turbo you're getting, get his feedback. Hopefully it's something he's familiar with and he can give you a bit more advice as to whether it's suitable for your engine. And I've done lots of other engine specific guides where we actually discuss turbo upgrades, and I've based that on feedback that I've got from my members, feedback from viewers on this channel, and just general research that I've done when looking into upgrading these engines. So if you've got any other tips to pass on, please let me know in the comments. I'm grateful for all of the feedback that we get. We're all here to learn. I certainly learn something new every day, and the more you learn about something, the more you realise there is to learn, and that's very much the case when it comes to turbo upgrades. So when you've upgraded the turbo on your A6, it's now time to think about the fueling. So we've gone over to direct injection on gasoline or petrol powered cars as well as diesel powered cars. The fuel systems provide a lot more fuel than they used to. They're running at much, much higher pressures, which actually means in most cases we have a lot more headroom to play with. So what sort of things should we bear in mind when it comes to fueling upgrades on the A6? The whole point of tuning your engine is to get it to burn more fuel. So increasing the injector capacity, so more fuel is going into the engine, is an obvious route to getting more fuel in the engine. But that needs to be supported by the high pressure fuel pump system, the thing that's pressurizing the fuel rail. So in most engines now you have a fuel rail where the pressurized fuel sits and the injectors effectively open. The injectors themselves set a spray pattern so the fuel atomizes as it goes into the engine. Some of the modern injectors have much more controllable settings, so you can alter the rates at which they open and really shape the rate of fuel that's going into the engine, and that has advantages when it comes to fuel economy and power. So upgrading the injectors, it's quite a minefield. There's a lot of different options out there, but you really want something that's tried and tested. So go to a specialist that deals with your specific engine and see what they've got in their lineup in terms of fuel injector upgrades. You're generally looking at a CC capacity, the amount of fuel that is injected. So increasing that capacity will deliver more fuel, but you obviously need to make other adjustments and just make sure that the fuel pump itself and the high pressure fuel pump are able to deliver sufficient fuel to the engine. In some cases, you may find that the high performance variants of your engine and even other models in the manufacturer's range offer better injectors. I note that some manufacturers have switched from a 4 nozzle setup to a 5 nozzle setup, and they've changed the injector type in order to maximize that spray pattern. So just dropping in injectors from the same manufacturer can often give you a little bit more headroom when it comes to tuning a car. So with engines, you've generally got port injection where the fuel is squirted into the intake itself. It goes over the valves into the engine where it mixes. And you've got direct injection where the fuel is directly injected into the cylinder, usually at the last moment. There's certainly advantages in both setups, and some of the newer engines that are coming out have both. They have port injection, which does help reduce the carbon buildup on the intake valves. A lot of people have also looked at methanol injection kits where a port injection setup is added to a direct injection setup. So that can supplement the amount of fuel going into the engine. Switching fuel types as well is another way of getting more power. For a lot of these other fuel types, you need to supply a lot more fuel to burn to make the power. So the injector capacity needs to be dramatically increased, but they generally work quite efficiently and quite cleanly. People have used various ethanol mixes. I've done videos that specifically discuss the different fuels and how people get more power out of engines just by swapping the fuel type. But for most people, for most of our viewers watching this channel, a simple fuel upgrade, changing the injector and the fuel pump, is all that's necessary. And often that's only necessary when you've bumped the power up by 50 to 100 horsepower. Again, that depends very much on your engine setup. I find that the modern factory direct injection setups deliver quite a lot of fuel. They're almost over specified from the factory, so that's good. There's usually a lot more scope there for extracting power out of these before you hit a problem. But make sure there's always spare capacity. Don't calculate the fuel delivery to the exact requirements of the engine, because as those injectors degrade and get older, the fuel pump degrades and gets older, you're going to start to be running out of fuel when you need it, and the engine itself is going to have to start backing things off. So thinking about the older engines on the A6, a lot of people were dropping in camshafts. So the camshaft profile would be changed and that would give you more characteristics. But it's not all good news. There are some downsides to fitting a fast road cam or a high performance cam to your Audi A6. So let's just chat about camshafts. Now, generally speaking, these are effective up to about 2006, 2007. From that point on, we had variable valve timing on most engines and most models. So when you have the variable valve timing, that kind of does the job of a performance cam, but it also keeps the low end torque where you want it to be, and you don't have the downsides associated with it. So on the A6 engines, the newer generations of engines for about 2007 onwards generally flow pretty well. So generally, the newer the engine is, the better the porting inside the head, the flow of air as it goes into the cylinders, and everything's been optimized really to maximize the efficiency. The manufacturers want to get the best fuel economy out of the engine. So on the older engines though, that wasn't really a consideration. So there's a lot more scope there to do porting, polishing and gas flowing of the head. So let's just talk about those options for your A6 and just see how that can help your project and just lift it to the next level. So the head of the engine, this is where all of the air goes into the engine and the exhaust gases come out. It's that bit at the top of the engine above the gasket where the valves reside. Now, a lot of gains can be had, particularly on older engines, by getting the head properly ported and flowed. So what they would aim to do is increase the airflow, increase the velocity of the air going into the engine to aid fuel mixing as well. If you've got port injection, you want that fuel to be mixing quite nicely with the air so it can fully atomize inside the engine itself. So changing the angles of the ports going into the engine, changing the size of the valves and obviously the ports that they sit in can dramatically alter the airflow going in and out of the engine. It's a very specialized area. I do see videos cropping up from time to time of someone with a drill and a grinding wheel just grinding away randomly. So to do it properly, you really need a flow bench. Some people talk about a wet flow bench as well, getting better readings and better characteristics looking at the flow rate on a wet flow bench. But generally it's a specialized area. You do need that specialist knowledge in order to maximize the flow into the engine, and you've got to take into account where you want the power. Do you want low end power, fuel economy? Do you want high end power? Those high RPMs really do need that high velocity of air and a lot of air to be moving. So I've done other videos that discuss head porting and head work in more detail, so be sure to check those out if this is something that's of interest to you. But as manufacturers have evolved engines over the years, the head design has dramatically improved. They've now got to meet very, very stringent emissions regulations. So the old days of where they would just cast an engine head and machine it and chuck it on the engine are long gone. A lot more work and research and design has gone into the head design, the flow rates, the size and the angles on the chambers themselves. So other mods you can do to the turbocharged engines is upgrading the intercooler. So is the intercooler a power mod? Do you get massive power gains on the A6 when you fit an intercooler? Obviously, we're just talking about the turbo models in the range. There's no performance advantage whatsoever to adding an intercooler to a standard naturally aspirated engine. So what can you expect from fitting an intercooler upgrade to your A6? And what are some of the things you need to look out for when choosing an intercooler? So the intercooler is basically a radiator, and it takes the compressed air from the turbo and cools it down. Why does it cool it down? Well, when you compress air, it gets very, very hot. The more the air is compressed, the hotter it gets. You've probably noticed that when you pump up your car tyre, the nozzle of the pump starts to get very warm. That's the effect of the compressed air heating up. So you really want that intake charge to be as low as possible when it comes to the intake temperature. So an intercooler effectively exposes that hot compressed air to the ambient air, and drops the temperature back down. So you might think that having a massive intercooler will add loads of power, but it doesn't quite work like that. The intercooler size is generally determined by the flow rate of the engine, and you can actually reduce the velocity and the flow rate significantly by going with the wrong intercooler design. Now, a larger intercooler does offer benefits over a smaller stock factory one in that it doesn't heat up as quickly. It will dispel the heat that builds up in the exhaust charge for longer periods of time. So with a lot of factory setups, the small intercooler is barely adequate. And if you're doing a lot of spirited driving, that intercooler itself is starting to get warm. And if the radiator that the hot air is going into is warm, it's not going to be as efficient at cooling it down. So upgrading the intercooler, it doesn't significantly add power. It stops you losing power in that situation where the intercooler has started to get warm itself. So resighting the intercooler, some engines have intercoolers mounted at the side, some they have a water-cooled intercooler where the water is then channeled to the front of the car and cooled down. So just changing the routing, aiding airflow through the intercooler itself can all help to reduce those intake temperatures. A lot depends on the engine you've got and the style of the engine bay of your car and how much scope you've got of maybe adding a larger intercooler at the front. But generally speaking, the front mount intercoolers perform really well. They're relatively cost effective. The downside is the long runs that you have in pipes to feed them. So that's why a lot of manufacturers have a water mounted intercooler mounted quite close to the engine. It's easier to pump the water around than it is to get the air charge moving around the engine bay. And they then expose that water to the ambient air temperature, which reduces the temperature of the water, which is then passed on to that intake charge as it goes into the engine. But we're talking about fairly complex setups there. So intercooler upgrades are usually quite expensive and they don't add significant amounts of power, but it can help to free up power on those higher powered projects. So finally, a mod that a lot of people have been talking about is the flywheel, making the flywheel lighter. The majority of modern engines have the dual mass flywheel, which often breaks down at higher mileages, so they're not as reliable. So a lot of people look to replace this as a troublesome component. But in reality, if you look after them and you change the flywheel about the same time as you change the clutch, you should have no problems whatsoever. So there's a few things that we just need to pass on to you so that you can understand how flywheels affect the car's performance and the plus sides and the downsides of fitting a lighter flywheel to your Audi A6. So the flywheel itself, what's it do? Well, it's a large metal disc, a weight on the side of the engine. And as the engine spins, the flywheel spins. So an engine is never perfect. There's a series of explosions going on at staged intervals. There's a lot of vibration going on in the engine. The components are moving up and down, left and right. There's an awful lot going on inside the engine, and you don't really want that to upset the smooth running of the engine. So the flywheel effectively stores the kinetic energy and just smooths everything out. So in the gaps where nothing is happening explosion wise in the engine, the flywheel is still rotating the engine assembly, the transmission assembly. So it keeps everything moving smoothly. So the heavier the flywheel is, the less inclined the engine will be to lose RPMs when you drop off the throttle. If the flywheel itself is lighter, the engine revs, the RPM will drop quite suddenly as soon as you ease off. So that can be beneficial in a race situation where, for example, you want to do some rev matching. You want those rev changes to happen very quickly to have maximum control over the engine. But on the long run, you really want the flywheel to maintain momentum. Otherwise, as soon as you hit a hill, you're going to have to make a conscious adjustment on the accelerator for every little fluctuation that you get, whereas the flywheel helps to keep everything smooth. So with some engines, they have a dual mass flywheel, which is essentially two sprung-loaded plates or weights, and they work to really dramatically minimize the amount of vibration going through the transmission from the engine. So a lot of dual mass flywheels start to suffer. They start to break down. The springs, there's a lot of vibration going on in them. They are taking a lot of abuse. But it's better to have that abuse in something that's relatively cheap to replace than in your expensive transmission or other components within the engine. So when people replace the clutch, they generally look to replace the flywheel. if you've got a dual mass flywheel, it is possible to replace it with a single mass flywheel, but on some engines, particularly older diesel engines, that's not always advisable. You really do want that protection from all the vibrations that are going on in the engine. But do ask people who've done this mod, specifically if they've got the same engine as you, and just compare notes. Is it giving you the advantages or the flexibility that you want? Another little plus of having a lighter flywheel is there's less weight in the car. And less weight allows the car to accelerate more quickly. It makes it handle better. So most people for an everyday car would just look to get a slightly lighter flywheel. You can get slightly lighter dual mass flywheels and slightly lighter single mass flywheels for most engines. So I hope this has been interesting. It's given you a good overview of all your tuning options when it comes to upgrading your Audi A6. I've done specific engine guides, so be sure to check those out in the engine guide section, because I've no doubt covered your engine in great detail. If I haven't, please let me know in the comments which model you've got. Thanks for watching. Please boot that like button, because that really does help us to get out there. And I'll see you in this next video that I've lined up for you that you should find interesting.